speaker Jayant Bhandari is the founder of Capitalism and Morality. He likes to speak his mind uninfluenced by what others might think about him. He has always found those people who abuse their power repulsive. As far back as he can remember, he has been a libertarian and got to know the label only after he started writing for the Mises Institute. He's a financial analyst, investor, and writer. He's constantly traveling and has been to 80 countries and has lived in 6. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite Jayant, my mentor, to the podium to talk about the pros and cons of American influence in the world.
So on March 19, 2003, I was walking the streets of Berlin. I was trying to convince the people on the street that what America had just started doing, which was to start bombing Saddam Hussein, was the right thing to do. I told them that that was a righteous fight. I told them that Saddam Hussein had to be got rid of. Those were very emotional days for me. I was on my way to Canada as a new immigrant. In a way, leaving India was an easy decision. It is a hellhole. Not just because of its government, but because of its people, every one of who thinks that he knows how I can live better. Having worked in India for 10 years after the completion of my post-graduation in the UK, I had realized that my education and skills had no value in India. Success at work was solely dependent on one thing: bribing around. That's what I did for 10 years, wining and dining with politicians and bureaucrats in New Delhi. I had come to also realize that this predicament wasn't going to change. For Indian society is hinged to expediency, a lose-lose paradigm of tribalism amply mixed with superstitions. With nothing solid to stand on and no concept of reason to accumulate intellectual and financial capital, everything in that country had a feral quality. When Indians protested about corruption, and you sometimes see that on the TV, or when people in New Delhi come out to protest against rape cases, the media wants to show you that India is finally waking up. The problem is that corruption is a problem for Indians only when they are recipient of when they are victim of corruption. When they are beneficiary of corruption, they have absolutely no problems with that. With the society conspicuously missing rational, hence moral underpinnings, it is impossible to wish away social ills. Corruptions and rapes are not going to go away. Every sign was that India and its institutions were going to continue to get worse, and this had continued since the time the British colonizers had left that country. Deep in my heart, I had a fantasy. I wanted America to attack and take over India. If that had happened, I would have avoided looking for a completely new life in a new country and finding new friends and new relationships. And more importantly, I would have not had to face my mom to tell her that I was leaving. Those days, walking around in Berlin, I was projecting my emotional state on Iraqis. Why wouldn't they want the same liberty I was aspiring for? After all, they lived in worse tyranny than I existed in. And within days of the US is starting to attack Saddam Hussein and with his regime is starting to fall apart, Iraqis were on the road greeting and welcoming US troops. Statues of Saddam Hussein and his palaces were getting destroyed and demolished. It seemed that there was a clear verdict from Iraqis that they had had enough of tyranny. And why shouldn't that be the case? After all, most people, virtually everyone I have known from these places, and I go to the Middle East once a year as well, they want to move to America. Obviously, they were welcoming American troops. But the scene started to change within a few months. Iraqis had grown tired of American troops. Chaos and fanaticism had been unleashed in Iraq. A virulent form of Islam was starting to spread in Iraq. Repression of minorities, Christians and other kind of minorities started to spread. Internecine violence within sects and between sects is skyrocketed. It was as if all of a sudden Iraqis did not want liberty, which I thought they aspired for. Now there are different kind of views among people, particularly in the West, about what America should do in the international affairs. Some people think that America should just completely avoid interfering in other countries because interference leads to more problem in those countries and creates problems for the US. There are, of course, other people who want the US to only engage in humanitarian work in these third world countries. And then there's, of course, a segment of the population in the West who wants to just simply annihilate these rogue and violent societies. I want to give my perspective on where the balance is, and I want to, for now, continue talking about America's influence in the world. It is extremely hard, actually impossible to imagine for anyone who has followed the events in Africa that the tyrants in Africa would not have conducted worse genocides were America not there. Every country, absolutely every country in Africa would have fallen into tribal chaos without the sanity provided by American influence. And I almost guarantee that most of you are not aware of a major crisis America recently enabled not to happen. In 2016, President Kabila of Democratic Republic of Congo had come to the end of his term. He decided not to vacate his seat. In fact, he decided not to even conduct the elections. But the international media would have not given you the information that was happening in DRC over those 2 years between 2016 and later part of 2018. And then they started writing glorious articles about what's happening in Africa. Congo, one of the most chaotic countries, in their view, was finally emerging, and that their people had finally started to accept democracy. But that's a lie. It's a complete lie. The reality is that this country, DRC, with population of 92 million people and a size as big as Western Europe, was close to a civil war, and the only reason elections were held was because America had applied sanctions on Congo and America had started to threaten Kabila. I'm almost sure most people don't know about this. Now imagine if America had not avoided the civil war, there would have been a massive genocide in Congo. But because genocide did not happen, we have no reason to thank America for what it achieved. My view is that without the influence that America has on Africa, there are at least, or the Western countries have on Africa, there are at least 1 billion extra Africans. Were the Western countries not there to provide sanity to these countries, they would have slaughtered each other, which is what they were doing before Europeans arrived. Or they would have fallen to famine and disease. Or more likely, most of them would have never been born in families suffering from famine and disease. Without the Western society, Africa would never have been let go by Malthusian equilibrium. Let's talk about the Middle East. Without the presence of the Middle East, without the presence of America, the Middle East would have fallen into much worse civil war than it currently has. A plethora of their leaders are fighting among each other right now, and this would have been much worse without American influence. The Middle East started to get a huge amount of easy money in the 1970s and 60s from oil. The reality is that were America not there to dictate these dictators in the Middle East what to do with that money would have got squandered much faster than it got squandered. Look at the GDP numbers of the Middle East. On per capita basis, most Middle Eastern countries, oil-producing Middle Eastern countries, had GDP per capita twice as much in 1970s than what it is today in real terms. So as if those people in the Middle East have destroyed half of their wealth-generating capacity, and as if the technological revolution that has happened in the last 50 years just went by without making any influence on the Middle East. Without the US influence, Bashar al-Assad, the dictator of Syria, would have killed a lot more people. But much worse, ISIS would have still continued to spread and become a much worse fanatic organization. But the story of America trying to save Muslim lives and lives of third world goes on and on. America was the country that saved lives of Muslims in Kosovo and elsewhere in what was Yugoslavia in late 80s and early 90s. Without America, the slaughter would have been much, much worse. Even today, the biggest protector of Muslim lives is actually America, although it gets blamed all the time. Currently, there are supposedly between 1 to 2 million people in re-education camps in Xinjiang, the Muslim province of China. Muslim countries, the Arabic countries, have completely ignored the existence of those re-education camps, where people are arrested and kept in camps because the Chinese government wants to remove the concept of Islam from their minds. Saudi Arabia recently gave China a stamp of approval for its human rights, as if China was doing nothing wrong. Imran Khan, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, was recently interviewed on TV, and you can watch it on YouTube. Xinjiang, the Muslim province, is actually borders Pakistan. Imran Khan completely ignored the existence of re-education camp, and he actually said he had no clue about the existence of these camps. Everyone else knows about it. The question, of course, comes up, isn't it that America supports dictator of Saudi Arabia and some other countries? Of course it does. And the world is not a perfect place. Ironically, were Saudi Arabia to become more free, it would actually become much, much more fanatic. Anyone who remembers the seizure of Grand Mosque of 1979 knows that Saudi Arabia needs to be a dictatorial country or it would actually become less free. But moreover, keeping Saudi Arabia stable and sane has a huge purpose for America, because if Saudi Arabia were not stable, Iran, the nasty regime of Iran, would get a free hand in the affairs of the Middle East. You simply don't have a third choice. You can blame America as much as you want, you just don't have a third choice. The story goes on and on. America was the country that stopped the spread of, or controlled the spread of communism in Brazil and Chile. In fact, were America not there, my guess is that whole of Latin America would have gone communist and USSR would have actually taken over influence on the Middle East. In the last 1 century, depending on who you ask, as many as 40 times or more, America directly or indirectly changed the governments in Latin America. Of course, I'm not denying the existence of the military-industrial complex. However, as barnacles go with the ship, military-industrial complex always, of course, goes for its own profits. The fact remains that while you can blame America as much as you can, and as Fergus was alluding to earlier, the fact remains that the third world is incapable of staying stable without Western help. This is a key principle. Let's move on to East Asia. It is hard to imagine what Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore would have been like were America not there to protect them and to let them grow economically. The interesting thing is that, quite in contrast to the disrespect that America gets elsewhere in the world, where it influences the local society, Koreans and Japanese actually have a favorable view of America. And I will come back later on what this means for what America should actually do in world affairs. But let's move on to something else. Without the US, I'm sure everyone would agree that North Korea would have developed fully operational nuclear weapons. And why just North Korea? Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Libya, Iraq, Iran, there were many, many countries that were trying to build nuclear weapons. America stopped it. My guess is that had this proliferation allowed to continue, the world would have become a big Chernobyl. Because we are not suffering, we don't have a reason to thank America for it dead. But besides contributing in terms of establishing political stability, the US does far more good than any other country on the planet, most of which goes unrecognized, unseen, and unappreciated. One of the distinct memories I have as a teen is of a bunch of men, women, and children tied through a rope being led to a construction site in India. I asked my parents who they were, and they said they were bonded laborers. That's a euphemism for slaves. India has more slaves than any other country on the planet, by the way. An estimated 20 to 65 million Indians are directly or indirectly victims of human trafficking. Girls are forced into prostitution and brought in from Nepal and Bangladesh to be sold and traded in India. Of course, they get traded in Nepal and Bangladesh as well. Boys and girls used to get trafficked, and I'm sure they still get trafficked in the Middle East for use on camel race purposes. This got reduced not because people of these countries found some empathy in their heart, it happened because of pressure from the US. As a kid, for whatever reason, I was always following news on what was happening with human rights abuses, trafficking, and slavery in the country. And I always wanted to see how the Indian government reacted to that and how the Indian population reacted to that. None of them cared a damn. There was hardly any whimper of protest from the middle class of India or the intelligentsia of India against the human rights abuses in that country. In fact, there's a common saying among the middle class in India and the intellectuals in India that prostitutes get what they deserve. Now, for the rich and well-placed people, the lower caste and lower class people are invisible. Their sufferings don't matter. You ask an average Indian middle-class person, and he will tell you with a straight face how high the standard of his life is, completely forgetful about the fact that he has a fleet of maids, servants, and chauffeurs to make his lifestyle. For him, in his imagination, they probably don't even exist as human beings. There's a big irony here, though, and the irony is that when the lower caste and lower class people of India get into power, the lack of empathy they exhibit is much worse than the lack of empathy that the middle class and the intelligentsia project has. I'm going to come back to that towards in very soon, but let me just end here about what good America does in the world in terms of humanitarian work that America does. There are at least a couple of billion, not million, a couple of billion more human beings on the planet because of an American agronomist, Norman Borlaug, who started what came to be known as Green Revolution, and he started that in 1960s. In the 1965 and 66, monsoon rain failed in India. Monsoon rain is the most important thing for agricultural production in that country. Surprisingly, Indian government had no clue that a famine was approaching. It was the US consulate in New Delhi that communicated to the Washington that India was heading towards a famine. America had to ship so much of grain that the grain prices America actually started to go up. And American government had to hide this information from Americans. They averted the famine. What Indians remember, and Indians do remember about this famine, and the grains that were supplied by the US, but what Indians remember is that these grains were of lower quality and were adulterated with weed and insects. Now, what you can be sure of is that there was no sign, and there is no sign of gratitude for America did in terms of saving hundreds of millions of lives in India. What happened at the same time was that American government negotiated with India that they had to free up the agricultural sector, or on a relative basis, make it more free, to make it more free market oriented, which also, of course, became the background for Green Revolution in India. And as a result, population growth of India is spiked up. So as if you look at the graph in the 60s and 80s, it just went straight up, the population growth rate. Now, what Indians remember about that event is that the US subjugated India. Now, Norman Borlaug was quite rightly given the Nobel Prize, but he made one huge mistake. He did not know about Malthusian equilibrium, or at least he did not take that into account, which must continuously operate among people who are irrational and tribal. Let me unpack whatever I have said so far and isolate what I think the US does that is clearly good and what the US does that is clearly unsustainable or even harmful. And I'm going to conclude with that most of the work that America does outside America is actually harmful for those people and for America. Let's dissect these issues. Removing dictators and imposing democracy simply does not work. It is the simplistic bureaucrats sitting in Washington who think that removing dictators and democracy would somehow improve these societies. Saddam Hussein's tyranny was the only stabilizing force in Iraq. Our next tyrant must come back in Iraq before Iraq becomes sane and stable on relative basis. Removing dictators and changing the form of the government outside the Western society and East Asian society leads to an immediate decay, case after case, in the societies affected, and then worsening continues. This is exactly what happened when democracy was forced on countries like Pakistan and Iraq and Myanmar. They are much worse because of democracy. Here is a principle. Countries like Libya and Iraq are stable only under the heavy hand and ruthless dictatorship. Democracy is, of course, not a magic wand which simplistic people and some people in America, in the Western societies today think. And it does not work even in the West. What happens in democracy is that the least competent and the most tribal people, and those people who are most desirous of bread and circuses, decide who runs society's institutions. Democracy is anti-reason, it's anti-progress, it's anti-civilization. India was an unmanageable country when the British ruled it. India's population is now 4 times larger than when the British were running it. Now here is the problem with India. The best people of India has left the country. The people who now, and that is why allowing good immigrants is actually make things worse for everyone, not better. And now, because of democracy, not just crooks, but brain-dead, irrational psychopaths rule that country, India. My guess is that India has at least 1 billion people over its Malthusian equilibrium. And this will kick in as soon as the force of sanity that US imposes on that region goes away. But really, what I said about India is just one example. That is exactly the case with the whole third world, which represents 5 billion out of 7.5 billion human beings on the planet. So, what this American influence on the third world achieved? It only achieved a temporary loosening of Malthusian equilibrium, which allowed for populations to become larger, which means that the humanitarian crisis will be much worse when the equilibrium kicks in again. Here's a problem with the Christian ethic. And the Christian ethic, from what I understand, is that Christians want to give without expecting in return. The problem is you must expect gratitude in return, because by not expecting gratitude, there's no feedback mechanism, which means that the receiver doesn't get it, that he's getting charity, and the giver keeps giving until the time the problem keeps increasing to a situation where the giver can no longer give. This leads me to make a decision on what I think is a massive problem that the US has created. Intervention is a thankless job and attracts disrespect of those helped. And the only countries that I would have that where America does not get disrespect is East Asia. The third world countries actively destroy any benefits that accrues to them through war, active destruction of capital, hedonism, population growth. In whatever way they can destroy all the benefit that accrues to them is what they choose, because among irrational people, Malthusian equilibrium is the dominating force. When the third world does not accept changing its culture, the US merely subsidize increasing the problems of the third world. However sad this may be, ladies and gentlemen, there's nothing that can be done. Those of us, and there are many people from the third world countries here, when we walk around our societies we left behind, when we see starving people, we don't feed every starving person. When we see human rights abuses happening, we don't help out every single person. There simply aren't enough resources. So, in conclusion, as the US influence recedes or gets tapped out, the world will become an extremely unstable place, the third world particularly. In my view, there's only one thing America should do, which is to protect itself and its cultural allies. And who are the cultural allies? The other Western countries and East Asia. But as Trump insists, helping out these European and East Asian countries must require gratitude in return. They should learn to say thank you, and they must learn to pull their own weight. Such a policy of self-protection for America will always mean that America will need to support dictators like those in Saudi Arabia, because we don't live in a perfect world. Without keeping control of proliferation of nuclear and biological weapons, we will become a big Chernobyl, and every person on the planet owes gratitude to America for avoiding that. There will be a massive humanitarian crisis in the third world, as America will no longer influence the third world. Hundreds of millions, perhaps billions, will perish from the third world. But any intervention can merely delay and worsen the problems. So it is best for America to stop interfering in countries where it does not affect the interests of America and its allies. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I have 5 minutes, huh? Yes, sir. Rajni? You may have to switch on. Yeah, that's good.
There's a thinking that India would eventually replace China as an economic power. Do you feel, knowing the mentality in India that exists, do you think this is possible?
I can bet $1 million it's not going to, I can bet $1 billion it's not going to happen. Not in my grandchildren's lifetime. China is just a completely different country to India. Those people who compare China with India are bookish people who sit in front of their spreadsheets and they try to project the growth rates of China and imagine that India would grow at the same rate as China at some point of time. The world doesn't work that way. Cultures are complex, societies are complex, and anyone, absolutely anyone, I was talking with an Indian gentleman earlier, he said India will always be a chaotic country. That is the nature of the society. So sorry, sir, it will always be a tribal country, and people should stop comparing China with India. Yes, sir.
Yeah. You talk about tribal, that is in the genes. Just because you come here and you become American, that's another tribe. Everybody supports their own team. That's one thing. The second thing is about the Malthus equilibrium. Malthus has been totally discredited by a person called Julian Simon. I have a list of 30 commodities over here, no, 50 maybe, from aluminium to banana to
Can we just, can I address
zinc.
one question at a time?
Just,
because
okay,
otherwise
just,
I'll lose track of it.
Yeah, only this question. Everything has become more abundant in terms of human labor. Not one commodity has increased in price in the last 30 years. And I have the list right
Okay,
over
I understand that. Let me respond to it, and then you can ask more questions. Firstly, tribal. Yes, we are all tribal. And as I said, nothing is perfect. There are degrees of tribalism. And compared to North European people, these countries in Africa are extraordinarily tribal. There is such a difference in tribalism that there is actually no comparison. Now, Julian Simon was wrong, sir. I know that it's politically correct to accept both by the left and the right that Julian Simon was correct, but population is not a resource because you can cut a cow, use its meat and skin. You can't cut human beings and eat their meat. So Malthusian equilibrium will work on human beings if they consume more than they can produce, unless you are allowed to cut them out when they are not productive. Now, I agree that prices of everything has fallen over the last 200 years. Prosperity has increased over the last 200 years. But listen, 200 years is not even noise in human affairs. Humanity has existed for, depending on how you count it, 50,000, 100,000, or a million years over that period. 200 years is not even a noise in that ratio, in that calculation. So you can't accept what happened in those 200 years to continue to happen in the future. Yes, sir. Rakesh.
Okay.
Yeah.
One more thing. I think it's only economic freedom and rule of law which works. As far as China is concerned,
Rakesh, you come back to your theoretical.
China is concerned. Their policy of having one child is going to be a big problem as as it starts to age. And if India has economic freedom, I will take that bet.
Okay.
I just don't know what the economics of the whole situation will be. So I'm saying that. But if India does what it should be doing as far as economic freedom is concerned, I'll be happy to take that bet with you.
Thank you.
Now, this might sound like a totally flippant and ridiculous question, but think about it for a few seconds, please. Would third world countries eventually become better if they were to legalize magic mushrooms?
Well, Rakesh, it's actually not going to work, and I have given, I take it very seriously. I have always for a long time, I thought that instead of America spending $2 or $3 trillion on Afghanistan, they should have just loaded hookers on a plane from some other countries and sent them to Afghanistan to help these people ease up a bit. Okay, there's a problem. There's a problem with that. Hedonism is just the other side of the same coin that savagery is. You have to base the society on reason and rationality, otherwise it does not work. Hedonism does no good to you, and it is no better than savagery. All hedonistic society must sooner or later become savage. Let's look at Latin America. Latin America is not a fanatic area. It's a hedonistic area, and that is the reason why it is, in a way, a reflection of what the Middle East is like, probably more savage than the Middle East is.
Not a question. I just wanted to make a slight variant on what you said. Sending a plane load of hookers to Afghanistan? No, sir. It's much cheaper and more effective to drop millions of Playboy magazines.
Well, pornography, Frank, is watched more in the Middle East and Pakistan on per capita basis than any other country on the planet. But I've come to the end of my time, so thank you very much, and we'll break for coffee.